everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to another historian episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is an historian making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today is a jack of all trades. She balances her work, volunteer, writing, editing, teaching, speaking engagement, and more, all the while being an inspiring mother, devoted wife, and unwavering friend to those around her. She's passionate about history, whether it's U.S. history, New Jersey history, music history, or military history, and that love shines through in her work. She has a true love of giving a voice to others through her years of oral history. The Vietnam veterans who she has spent years with and turned many of their stories into a book that sold out in its first few days, and a touching exhibit dedicated to the aftermath and devastation of Superstorm Sandy at the Jersey Shore, to name just a few. She treats every project with dedication, care, enthusiasm, and respect. And if you have spent even 5 minutes in her company, professionally or personally, and perhaps a mix of both, you will immediately know that she is a true gem. She's equal parts inspiring educator and perpetual student, always eager to learn more, and just as excited to teach the next generation. At the same time, she is equal parts writer and reader, excelling in putting words on a page that compels you to read them, and transcribing oral histories and interviews into written records, yet also a voracious reader, an exceptional proofreader and editor. She is one of a kind in each aspect of her life, and the opportunity to work with her in any capacity is one any organization should jump at immediately. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, historian Melissa Ziobro. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me and that lovely introduction. Are you going to reveal now where it came from?
I will reveal it at the end, a little surprise at the end. But Melissa, in all seriousness, I'm super excited to have you here. And I've been following your work for some time now. And I'm so excited to have you here and to learn more about your background in history. And of course, for people who know you, your work at the Bruce Springsteen Museum, which honestly, I did not know there was such a thing, but I am glad to be proven wrong. So, Melissa, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners about your background?
Oh gosh, so do you want me to kind of start with the beginning, like how I become a historian, or how would you like to proceed?
So let's start from the very beginning. What put you on this path for history?
Sure. So I always loved history growing up, even, from the time I was little, I loved reading like the great illustrated classics, and I'm really into biographies going back to like grade school. I always loved history, but as I got older and, went to college, I'm actually a Monmouth University alum, it was not clear to me that was a career, right? I was always a very practical person, even as a child. And, when I started college, it was not clear you could do anything with a history degree. That is very wrong, by the way, as we will discuss. There are many things you can do with a history degree. But when I started undergrad, I thought that I would go to law school because I could be, a history and political science dual major. So I was going to go to law school. And then Monmouth University very smartly requires all undergraduate students to do some type of experiential education. And so my internship was for the national parks at Sandy Hook, Fort Hancock on Sandy Hook, specifically here in New Jersey. And I worked with an amazing curator, Mary Rassa there, and as an undergraduate had the opportunity to do oral histories and exhibits, and it was a tremendous opportunity that I very much enjoyed. But the semester ended, the internship ended, and I still thought I would go to law school, but that internship supervisor recommended me for a job with the Army. in the historical office at Fort Monmouth, an active duty military base. And so I had my first big person job right out of college working as a historian for the US Army. And I always tell that story because I want my students in particular to understand a few things. One, you need to take your internships so seriously, right? Because I cannot tell you how many people have their internships turn into their full-time jobs. Either they get hired by internship location or their intern supervisor recommends them for something else, right? So that's the first lesson, is take those internships seriously, take your networking seriously from a very early age. And also, there are jobs with a history degree, right? With a history major.
Yes, absolutely. Very true. And we're going to be touching on all of that, especially when we get to the business side of being an historian. But let's still also talk about the lead up, the road to becoming an historian. So for you, Melissa, once you finish your education and you were out there in the world, before you even got picked up to work as a historian at the Army base, and then even afterwards, what has been sort of like your goal as an historian working in various occupations, whether it's, working as an exhibitor or a volunteer, a teacher, and ultimately the promise you're making to not just your students, but also fellow colleagues who work with you?
Well, I think that, as historians, I think every historian should be a public historian, in other words. So I finished my undergraduate degree and went to work as a public historian, but I didn't even know what that word meant because it wasn't discussed in history classrooms so much 20 plus years ago, right? Public history simply means doing history outside the classroom, right? In the simplest possible terms. And my perspective on being a historian is that every historian should be a public historian because we want every citizen of this great nation, right, to understand our past, to understand how we got to where we are today, to extract lessons from the past so that we can be our best possible selves going forward. So every historian should think of themselves as a public historian because we want our work to reach and to impact as broad a public as possible. And if we want the public to care about history, to be interested in history, we need to make it accessible and engaging. That's really, really important. I can't tell you how many people I meet, whether it's students in a classroom or people, out in the general public who think, oh, history is boring. Well, if you think history is boring, it is because it's been taught to you wrong, right? It's because you are under the misconception that history is memorizing dates and names. And like, if history was just memorization, I would probably think it's boring too, but it's not. History is full of these incredible stories, you couldn't even make up. And it's relevant to our everyday lives. So just, kind of broad perspective on being a historian. Again, to circle back, every historian should be a public historian because we want to make history accessible and engaging so that people care, so people learn, so that we are all, the best informed global citizens that we can be.
Absolutely. Very true. Very, very true, Melissa. So there's also something that we're also going to touch on a little bit more when it comes to, being a historian in the workforce. And I've talked to a lot of historians on the show, from educators, students, content creators, and more. And this question I always love asking to hear their thoughts on, which is, telling, friends and family that, I'm going to be pursuing history as a career. And some of the responses I've gotten have been mixed, but it also brings up this notion of, why is it sort of like when we talk about, history as a career, responses always differ depending on the subjects. So for you, Melissa, did your family know from the get-go that history was what you wanted to pursue growing up?
I think everybody knew I loved history, but I think my parents were probably very relieved when I initially thought I was going to be a lawyer, right? Because that's a very concrete career path, right? People think, okay,
Yes.
you've got a law degree, you're always going to have a job. I think if you say you want to study history, there's more of a, well, what are you going to do with that?
Yes.
But again, as I tell my students, there are plenty of jobs, right? You can decide that you're going to pursue, being a curator or an oral historian, or, and there are historians who are working all throughout various branches of the federal government, and historians who are working for nonprofits and for think tanks, and we could go on and on and on. And your job title doesn't necessarily have to be something like historian or curator, but are you working in marketing? My goodness, even look at the CEOs of like Fortune 500 companies. A lot of them have history or other types of humanities degrees, because people who can read, write, think, articulate, they are always going to be in demand no matter what the field. So, I think when people are like, oh, you got a history degree, oh, you got a humanities degree, what are you going to do with that? That's so shallow. It's such a shallow way of looking at it. Dig a little deeper and see that there are things that you can do with these degrees for sure. Now, of course, the current climate and slashes in funding that are taking place are making the job market a little more difficult than it has been. It does give me a little more pause now when I'm advising students about what they're going to be doing, after they leave Monmouth University. But again, I'm sure all hope is not lost. And I think now more than ever, we need critical thinkers, historical thinkers in the world.
Absolutely. Very, very true. And this leads into the next question, which is, of course, what does it mean to be an historian in the digital age? Because the field and the industry has changed within the last 20 years. I mean, now you have historians making profiles on social media, promoting their content. I've even had some teachers, some retired teachers on the show who make YouTube videos about, Southern Italy or the history of the Crusades. And also, I've even had people who have gone down the road of being authors. They've written books on, case in point, two very good friends of mine in the UK, Dr. Tibble and Dr. Thomas Smith, who are, in my opinion, some of the leading authorities on the history of the Crusades, and they are just so knowledgeable. And they have written numerous books on the subject and built their online presence. But with that said, and this affects everybody, social media is a double-edged sword. It can be your best friend, it could be your worst enemy, especially the latter, because social media has, unfortunately, especially in the field of history, leads to some either historical essays or topics that are not factually sound, but unfortunately they are everywhere. And even some instances, people who are, fellow students, but they're very passionate about their subject, have been called out saying that, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. You're still a student. What do you know? And all of that stuff, which is very unfortunate. And that can be very detrimental to a person's overall well-being. So for you, Melissa, in particular, when you began this journey of yours and gathering new skills along the way, broadening your scope of history, did that thought ever come to your mind of, heightened anxiety or some elements of imposter syndrome? And, over the years, what has disciplined you to, be the best historian, the best public servant you can be?
Oh, I love that you use that term public servant, because I do, think that many historians think of it as a public service. So I would unpack that a few ways. I think that the digital age makes history a lot more accessible in many, many different ways, right?
Right.
So look at, for example, institutions who are digitizing their collections and getting materials online. I love that, right? Because we can ensure that these materials that we hold in the public trust are reaching people as widely as possible, right? We can put digital versions of exhibits online so that people who can't come to our brick and mortar museums, etc., can enjoy them, can learn from them, right? I think that historians, if they are comfortable with it, should put themselves out there in the public because their voices are needed, right? I just noted if they're comfortable with it. It always makes me like giggle that I'm a public historian because the public terrifies me. Like I would much rather be alone, curled up quietly reading a book. So I don't know, how I get up and teach a class or do a lecture or do this interview with you, but I digress. I think the problem though is we need thoughtful historians out there, public facing, harnessing internet age technologies, but anyone can get online and call themselves a historian. And I want to be careful here not to gatekeep, because I think that for a long time it was like, well, who gets to call themselves a historian? It has to be somebody with a PhD and a tenure track job. And I reject that. I don't think that is necessarily the case. But at the same time, we do have people with no background, no credentials of any kind, who are not doing their due diligence to fact check, who can just get on YouTube or TikTok and say anything. And a lot of times it's wrong. And as a historian, you're screaming, oh no, like, yes, I want history to be accessible. I want it to get out to the masses. I don't want to gatekeep who gets to do history, but at the same time, I don't want people just spewing misinformation. So then history runs into a larger societal crisis, I think, of information literacy, and that the consumers of content often don't know how to discern what is trustworthy and what is not. And so I have no good answer for how we rectify that, except that I want people to be more information literate and to vet their sources a little more carefully.
Absolutely, 100%. And this actually kind of goes into a topic that I haven't used as much, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Melissa. And I don't even know if your students have probably brought this to their attention or they have heard of it from a friend of a friend. And that is the term, the armchair historian. And I would love to hear for you, what does that mean, the term armchair historian?
Yeah, I think it has a little bit of a negative connotation. Again, someone who is not a PhD, tenure track historian out there doing history. But I think you can be a quote armchair historian and still be very educational, still be sharing factually accurate information in appealing ways. And we need people like that. The problem is when people call themselves a historian and then spread misinformation, whether it's purposely or because they got their information from Wikipedia, and they are asserting themselves as an expert. I have two teenagers, and my younger son loves watching history videos on YouTube. And so sometimes I'll catch them, with him. And sometimes I'm like, wow, this is amazing. This is information that is being relayed to a 14-year-old who is now voluntarily sitting here learning history for fun, right?
Yes.
And when it's accurate information, I'm like, great, this is the greatest thing in the world. But then sometimes I catch wildly inaccurate information. And does my 14-year-old know how to identify that? No, he's just absorbing misinformation now. So, I think the way we combat that is there's no history police that are going to go around, yelling at these YouTubers or getting their accounts taken down because they're spreading factually inaccurate information. But what the quote good historians or the accurate historians need to do is get themselves out there to try to combat that, right?
Yes.
But if your quote unquote serious historians aren't entering into the public arena to engage with people in accessible ways, then they can't combat the spread of misinformation.
That is very true. That is very true. And actually, what you just brought up is something that we'll touch on when we get into the business side. But before we get to that, there was a fun little question I wanted to ask you, Melissa, and it's a two-parter. And this actually is a fan question that I think worked perfectly. And the question is, so, Melissa, in your extensive career in history, what has been your favorite subject to teach in history? And the follow-up to that, what has been the most challenging subject to teach in history?
Oh my goodness. That's a really, really hard question. And honestly, it would probably change every day that I ask it, right? That you ask me it. So I
Right.
have taught over a dozen classes. I've been teaching at Monmouth University since 2007. So it'll be 18 years this fall semester. And I've taught over a dozen different classes, from like Western civs to U.S. history, New Jersey history, Vietnam War, business and economic development of the United States. And then I do all our public history classes, which are the skills-based classes for students who want to do history outside the classroom. So those include like Intro to Public History, Oral History, Historic Preservation, Museums and Archives Management. So I taught a lot of different classes. Now, if you ask me my favorite class to teach or the most fun subject to teach, probably history in Hollywood, which I did for a while.
That's really a good one.
And it was not history of Hollywood, it was history and Hollywood. And so we assessed the ways historically that Hollywood has done right by history and gotten history really, really wrong, right? So that was a really fun and engaging class. I enjoyed that one. Probably the most difficult class for me to teach is the Vietnam War class. I really like teaching that class. It's very important. But I inevitably cry, several times throughout the semester. It's just the material is tough. And having had the honor of doing interviews with and otherwise working with Vietnam vets over the years, and I feel truly understanding the depth of their experience, the trauma of their experience. That's always a tough class to teach, although
Right.
I think it's very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very true. And, teaching is something that we're also going to be talking about when it comes to, understanding one's audience as an historian when we get to the business side. Before we get to that, there is one more reflective question, which I would really love to hear your thoughts on. So context for this question, I've been doing the show now for about 6-7 years, which is insane. 400 or so episodes.
That's amazing.
Thank you. And I've had the opportunity to meet so many incredible historians from the UK, here in the States, abroad, and I've learned so much from all of them. And a majority of them began their careers in history professionally at the start of 2020, as I like to call the COVID years or the lockdown years. And there's been this debate of whether or not the COVID years have become, or were, I should say, a breeding ground for new voices, because as soon as things started getting a little bit easier, you had these new voices, new talent enter the historical arena. And I find it absolutely incredible. I've had guests who have been on the show before, but then made their return after they had taken some time to go back to school. Some have written dissertations, some have turned dissertations into books, and it's amazing. So many new and talented voices I absolutely love. And some have argued that because of these new voices, we have entered a golden age. Some have argued even further, saying that we are in a new age, or rather an iron age. And of course, some have even gone further and said that we are not in either a golden or iron age, but into a pseudo dark age with artificial intelligence being used in the field of history. And what I mean by that, viewers and listeners, is making historical content, whether that is videos, whether that is asking to write papers, especially the latter, because just like as authors, when you have a program write something for you, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, you lose that human element. You use that human connection. And in the fiction world, it mass produces a false sense of creativity. For the nonfiction academic side, it also does the same thing. It produces a mass-produced false sense of authenticity. So ultimately, Melissa, from your experience, where do you stand on this issue? What are your thoughts on this discussion?
Well, for me, COVID personally didn't really impact my career any. You're making me feel old now, because I started my career in 2004. So I was already, well into things by the time COVID hit. For me, the trickiest thing about COVID was trying to personally teach online for the first time while having two young kids at home who were trying to do school. So, if the COVID-19 pandemic brought more voices into the field. That's great. Again, the more voices, the better. As far as the AI component of the question, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety in academia right now about what AI is going to do to our students and to our work. I think every time there's a new technology, it's going to cause people angst. So, we've got to just kind of wait and see what happens. I've been experimenting with AI a little because I want to understand, how my students are going to see it, how my students are going to engage with it. And I've not been impressed thus far. Maybe I just don't know how to use it properly. But for example, I'm playing with ChatGPT and I asked it about me. And it said that I was like an award-winning criminal justice professor. I was like, well, that is certainly not the case. And if you Google me, there's a fair amount of stuff that comes up. Like I said, I've been at this 21 years. So for ChatGPT to get something that simple wrong, I was like, oh, that's alarming. And then there's another project I'm working on recently, an exhibit project. And I'm proofreading some text panels. And there was something that was, very factually inaccurate. And I questioned, well, where did you get this? Because I was trying to understand like the source material and if I could untangle why the information on the text panel was inaccurate. And they're like, oh, it was ChatGPT. So those are like two examples that come right to mind for me where, we've got to be really, really careful if we choose to incorporate that technology as historians in any way. It's probably not bad as a starting off point. Right? Just like I tell my students, there are some faculty members who are like, no, Wikipedia, you can never look at Wikipedia. And I will say to my students, like, yeah, look at Wikipedia. If that's your jumping off point and that gets your gears turning, just understand that that's your jumping off point. And then you're going to go verify every single thing with a primary source, with peer-reviewed sources, right? So if ChatGPT is going to like help get the ball rolling for someone, fine, I'm not a Luddite, like try that, but understand that you need to verify everything the old-fashioned way. I have friends though who work in other fields, real estate marketing, and they think ChatGPT is the greatest thing ever. They're using it to do all their writing for them. They see it as a tool not unlike Microsoft Word spell check function. It's a tool that exists for them to use. So, just coming back to historians specifically, we have to be very, very, very careful about fact checking, about nuance, about interpretation.
Yes, absolutely. And my favorite argument to say for using AI in any format to write or create anything is like asking an alcoholic 7th grader to do the work for you. It's not going to be the best. It's going to have a lot of mistakes. I'm pretty sure the AI is going to misspell certain things, and ultimately you're going to end up being the editor. And you're going to realize I should have just done this from the beginning. A lot of learning curves, to say the least.
Can I just say, researching and writing is fun. Like, I don't want ChatGPT to do that for me. I want to do it because it's fun.
Absolutely. I have to agree. As a person who loves to write military articles and military history and also write historical fiction, I love doing the research. I love doing that. And that came at a time now that I can say that because initially I was unsure of what my future was like in the field of history. And that, of course, now segues into the business side of being a historian. So as a little jumping off point, Melissa, looking at your career thus far, is there anything that you would have done differently, or would you have just let everything gone the way it should have?
No, I almost feel guilty with how lucky I have been in my career, truly. By the time I finished my undergrad, I was already working at Fort Monmouth. Again, I worked at Fort Monmouth from 2004 to 2011 as a historian, archivist, and curator. So I was a federal government employee, like wonderful job, wonderful pay, wonderful benefits, doing work that I felt was incredibly important and fulfilling. And then when the base I worked at closed, my job was moving to Maryland. The Army would have paid to move me and my family to Maryland, but I always say I resigned in protest rather than leave the great state of New Jersey. But again, I was just lucky and I wound up teaching at my alma mater full time.
Wow.
And then 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to move to the university's Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music full time. So, I graduated college and started working as a historian 21 years ago, and I have never been unemployed. So I have just been very, very, very lucky. And, I'm very fortunate to say there's nothing I would do differently.
Absolutely, 100%. And actually, speaking of working at the Bruce Springsteen Museum, can you tell our viewers about how you got involved with that and why that also is important in, the field of history? I know some people may not have said this, but I know when people think of like these small specific exhibits or specific museums, maybe people assume like, okay, well, what's sort of important about the history of Bruce Springsteen, or the JFK Library or the Nixon Library or the Reagan Library. There's a lot of history that correlates with these people. So would you like to share with your experience working there and ultimately what you have learned as an historian?
Yeah, so I get it. It could feel like kind of niche, but when we unpack our mission, it's twofold. So we are the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. So we are Bruce Springsteen's official repository, and he is, whether you like Bruce Springsteen's music or not, he is an artist whose career spans 50 years. So his songbook, his catalog records 50 years of American history, right?
Yeah.
His earliest songs talking about the Vietnam War, and he talks about, economic conditions in the United States and race relations in the United States and 9/11, right? So his work alone is a primary source that documents life in America for the past 50 plus years. But then we are also the Center for American Music. And with our exhibits, our programming, our publications, we teach all of American history through the very accessible prism of music. So earlier, I was talking about how historians, their voices are important, but if they want to break through to people, they have to be accessible and engaging. Well, I think music is one of the most accessible and engaging prisms through which we can teach U.S. history, right?
Yes.
And so I started working with the Bruce Springsteen Archives when I was still in my full-time faculty role, because, previously, if I was teaching an oral history class, we would find a local small museum or historical society to partner with. And instead of taking a final exam, we would do a capstone project with them. Well, when the Springsteen Archives came to our campus, my students and I started partnering with them. And so I've been working with the Springsteen Archives collection going back to 2016. In the summer of 2023, they were getting ready to announce that they were building a new 30,000 square foot museum on our campus. And they needed to grow the staff in order to build that museum. So
Right.
They were recruiting me from the Department of History and Anthropology. And I was like, gosh, I love teaching. I love my students. Do I want to make this change and go from being a full-time educator back to being a full-time, historian, curator, and archivist? And as I thought about it, I said, they expect minimum 50,000 people a year to come to the new museum once it opens in June 2026. So in my classroom, I might see 100, 150 students a year, because Monmouth has small classes. So
Right.
I can educate 100 or 150 people a year, or I can educate 50,000 people a year through the museum. And so that's how I made that choice and how I moved from teaching full-time back to doing public history full-time. And now we are, doing traveling exhibits, and I've got a number of publications under works, and of course, designing the exhibits for this exciting new museum.
Absolutely. And this correlates to the next question, which is understanding the audience. And the reason I bring this up is that, as historians, we are academically trained to speak and write and interact in a certain way. I imagine as a teacher, you spoke in a certain way that may be slightly different to how you engage with the public. And this brings up the notion of, understanding who our audience is. So for you, Melissa, when you speak, do you speak in the same style of, fellow like-minded academics, or I should say, have you changed your approach to public speaking to where you're now retelling history, but being mindful that people may not be, what's the word? May not understand the academic jargon or lingo that a colleague might have at a university.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just joking with somebody this morning about like my normal voice and my Professor Ziobro voice. And, I kind of joke that when I have to be Professor Ziobro, I have this out of body experience where, you become very serious. And I would say you do need to know your audience. And to go back earlier to my comment about all historians should be public historians, I think if you pick up like the American Historical Review right now, or like some scholarly peer-reviewed journal, it often sounds like historians talking at other historians. The general public is not going to pick that up and read that. And that's fine. I don't judge that. Like, there's a time and a place for that, and some people want to do that. That's fine. But when you're talking to your students, you need to speak a little differently. And when you are, say, curating an exhibit for the public or writing a book for the public, you need to speak a little differently. The rule of thumb that a lot of public historians use is that you should write exhibits, for example, to like a 6th grade reading level. You are not trying to impress the public with how smart you are and what fancy words you know, because they're not going to be impressed. They're just not going to read it. And so it's not about dumbing history down. It's about speaking normally, and being accessible, because you're not educating anybody if you're talking over their head or boring them to death.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very true. And this ultimately, this understanding of who we are comes from also the people we work with and, just trial and error. And this goes into probably a very important question, which is something that you mentioned earlier, is there are history jobs out there. And this brings up a very important discussion I've had with a lot of guests, which is, out of all the other fields where there are career workshops, I feel and believe humanities, specifically history, doesn't have that as much, which is very, very unfortunate, because as we're taught in academia, if you choose a history degree, there are 2 paths for you. You either go straight into teaching as a professor, or you go down the road of a government employee working at a federal building or what have you. But there are the middle path takers who just pull from different things, but it doesn't get a lot of recognition and sort of like a lot of help. And to give context to this, I was at my university, which was San Francisco State. It was the last second to last month of the final semester. And I was invited to partake in a workshop class of, history beyond academia.
Yeah.
And that is where I met an historian who is a world-renowned author. And he said that you can use your degree in history to write books or write. And from then on, I've been writing history magazines. And for those who know me, I also had the opportunity to showcase my history writing in 2 books. The first book is an historical fiction novel called Amanus, Son of Persia, which takes place during the Greco-Persian Wars. And upcoming this year is the newest one, Decimus, the Wolf of Rome, which sets the stage in 216 BC during the Punic Wars. But I digress. Ultimately, I wouldn't have pursued that had I not taken a workshop class and met people who were like-minded and showed other avenues. So ultimately, Melissa, in your opinion, do you feel that these kinds of workshops should be a must for the history department?
Absolutely. And to any, fellow faculty members listening to this, I encourage you to get involved. I have heard faculty members kind of suggest that they don't have a responsibility to prepare students for the job market, to say like, oh, that's why we have a career services department, and to me, no, because our field is very niche.
Yes.
So I believe, have a responsibility to our students to take it upon ourselves to help them. So, for example, I, organize an annual careers panel where I have, 6 to 8 working historians come in and talk about what they are doing. Or I am always leveraging my network to get students internships, to get them jobs. I think we have an incredible responsibility to do that. And so I encourage any, fellow history faculty who may listen to that, think about what you can do to help your students, because our field is very unique. And I think it's unlikely that your generic career services department at your university, no matter how hardworking and well-meaning, I think they're unlikely to be able to assist your students on that front the way that you can.
Absolutely, Melissa, absolutely. And on this topic of networking, I'm now going to reveal the connection who actually wrote that incredible description of you. And that was the individual, Jenna Wheeler, who has, in her review to you, has known you for 25 years and attests that you are superb in every aspect of your life.
Well, I have to send her a thank you card when we get off this podcast, since she was so sweet.
Yes, but that kind of goes back to, connections and networking, which is very important. I'm curious, are there any other people?
It's so important.
So are there any other people that you would like to give a shout out to who have helped you on your journey? And how important is it for historians to begin networking early on?
Yes, so I touched on this a little bit earlier. Like, from the time you are an undergrad, have relationships with your faculty, right? Like, get to know them, get to know their interests, go see them at a conference if they're presenting, take your internship seriously, volunteer at a local historical society site, whatever, if you have the time and the means to do that. It is so important to grow your network from very, very early on, because you never know who you're going to collaborate with in the future. I cannot express how important it is to grow and to authentically maintain a robust network. And it's just fun, right? To have like-minded people that you can talk to or go to conferences with or what have you.
Yes, very true. Very, very true. And this is another
let me not forget, you said to name specific people.
So yes, that's right.
I mentioned Mary Rassa earlier. I'm still in touch with Mary. She, was at the national parks, and she was my internship supervisor back when I was an undergrad. Like I said, we're still in touch. And then when I moved to Fort Monmouth, I worked with another amazing woman who's only a few years older than me, but became such a friend and mentor, Wendy Rajan. She now works for the State Department. Also at the fort, my supervisors were Mike Brady, Henry Carney. These were men who were really established in their careers, but took me so seriously and mentored me and saw my potential as a very young woman just out of my undergrad years. And then when I moved into teaching, my former faculty who are now my colleagues, Katie Parkin, Chris DeRosa, Rich Veit, Fred McKittrick, became cherished friends. And so I'm glad I had the opportunity to name some names, although now I'm going to lose sleep over who I might have left out.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Melissa. And, we're almost nearing the end of this incredible historian's interview. So as a final question to cap off, this one's going to be more of a little role play, a little scenario. So let's say you've been invited to, as you mentioned before, like you want to use your connections to bring a panel of historians to help your students. Well, let's say one of your connections invited you to do the very same thing, and you are in front of a crowd of young students who are historians and possibly fellow history enthusiasts from different backgrounds, all with different interests in the field of history. And of the pool of topics to discuss with them, what is the one topic that you would like to discuss with them and also leave with them as a pearl of wisdom?
Okay, so what advice am I imparting on young historians?
Advice for young historians, and also if you were to teach a topic to this panel or to this crowd of young historians, what would it be?
So my advice would be to think very long and hard about going into academia specifically, right? The idea of getting a tenure track job, 500 people apply for every tenure track job. So that is something that I cannot in good conscience encourage young historians to do. Look at public history, certainly. Look at all the creative ways you can deploy your history degree and make a true difference in the world.
Yes.
That would be my advice. Now, if we're teaching a class just for fun, gosh, what would I want to teach just for fun? You know, these days I'm doing so much Bruce that we would probably talk a little bit about using Bruce Springsteen's lyrics as a prism through which to explore life in 20th century America.
Awesome. Incredible,
We
Melissa.
could use a lot of music in that talk, right? So that would be fun.
That would be. And also, since we're talking about music, I would just say this. If you ever decide to use music in a class, I would definitely look up the group Sabaton. They are a Swedish rock group that write historical songs. One of my favorites is Shuriyama, about the Battle of Shuriyama, the Lost Battalion in World War I, the Night Witches, which is about the Russian night witches of World War II, and Devil Dogs, which is about the Marines at the Battle of Belleau Woods. There are so many great songs. They're just so good. They're so well sung, but the history behind them is so good. And for any historian that wants to use that as research for anything, for a topic of music and history, definitely look up Sabaton. They are an incredible group. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing historians interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. A huge thank you to Melissa for making her official debut here on the show. We wish her the very best. And Melissa, where can people find you if they want to reach out? And do you have any upcoming announcements you'd like to share? Maybe special exhibits coming to the Bruce Springsteen archives, anything else in terms of presentations or discussions?
Yeah. So where do I start? Let's see. So my two most recent books I would urge everybody to get. One is Fort Monmouth, the U.S. Army's House of Magic. It is a historical overview of that base that I mentioned I started my career at, but the technologies that came out of Fort Monmouth, it was a research and development hub. The technologies that came out of the fort not only saved lives on the battlefield, changed the way we all live. So the roots of the technology that run your computer, your cell phone, your weather app, your Ring camera, all come out of Fort Monmouth in some way. And my author royalties from that book go to a local National Historic Landmark, the InfoAge Science and History Museums at Camp Evans. I would briefly mention my most recent book, the one that came after Fort Monmouth, is The Battlin Bastards of Bravo. It is an oral history of a Vietnam War unit, the first of the 506, 101st Airborne. So everyone's got to check that one out because it tells history in the words of the men who lived it. It is just such a compelling, harrowing, inspiring, sometimes even funny read. And my royalties from that one are being donated to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. So those two are out there. Our Springsteen archives stuff, if you will. We've got a traveling exhibit, Music America, which features roughly 150 artifacts from some of the biggest names in music history. Ray Charles, Madonna, Kurt Cobain, Tupac, I could go on and on. It tells the story of 250 years of American history through music. That exhibit is currently at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station, Texas, if anybody's in the Texas area. And then locally here in New Jersey, my goodness, visit springsteenarchives.org to see the calendar of events that we've got going on at the archives. Even though our new museum does not open until next year, roughly June of 2026, construction God's willing, we already have a robust lineup of events. I host a monthly author talk series online. We've got a week-long series of Born to Run 50th anniversary events coming up. So I know we're out of time. I will stop, but visit springsteenarchives.org for more on that, or to connect with me specifically. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Excellent. I'll provide all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another amazing episode here on the show. A huge thank you to Melissa. We wish her the very best from one historian to another. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with all new episodes coming soon, as well as new updates in regards to the release of Decimus, which is still planned for the end of 2025 or possibly even earlier, as well as new books in the works, which I will announce since I've made some uploads here and there. The Wolves of Nobunaga, which is a samurai historical fiction series set in 16th century Japan. And the one I'm most excited to announce is, of course, The Heroes of the 26th, Battle for Bataan, which is my first World War II historical fiction series about the 26th Filipino Scout Cavalry, a lesser known and often overlooked unit of World War II history that fought against the Japanese during the initial invasions of the Philippines from late 41 into 42. So be on the lookout for more details on that. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And see you all in the next episode.